Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to see how the church goes mega in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. First, I want to talk about a book that came out in 1970. It sort of spearheaded this descent into what I sometimes call last days madness. The Bible talks about the last days, but Peter talked about the last days in Acts chapter 2 and said they were beginning back in his day. In 1970, Hal Lindsey published his late great Planet Earth. Had a very bold cover. Really, the color scheme and the design of the book reach out and grab you, and it was written in a very easy to understand conversational style. The first half of the book talked about prophecy in the Bible and how so many of those prophecies had been fulfilled, prophecies of the fall of Babylon and the city of Tyre and things that happened in the ancient world, but also prophecies of the coming of Jesus and how those had been fulfilled. It was a very good book in those opening sections, but then it moved from there to future prophecy. And Hal Lindsey had come from Dallas Seminary, so he held to that dispensational scheme that we talked about in a previous class that had been sort of invented or brought about by John Nelson Darby back in the 1800s and had been popularized. And this breathed some brand new life into that dispensational prophetical scheme. Um, and in the book, Lindsay points out that Israel had become a nation in 1948, and he cited a prophecy in Matthew chapter 24, it's around verse 34, 36, somewhere in there, that says, this generation shall not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. And he said, well, that must be the generation that sees the return of Jesus, or the return of Israel as a nation. And within that generation is about 40 years, he said, so that about 40 years after 1948, you should see the return of Jesus. Of course, that would make it 1988. Now, he didn't say Jesus is coming in 1988, but he said it could be right around that time. So he's, saying it's, sort of like, it might rain today. Jesus might come back, but he had put a time frame on it, and others picked up on that and then ran away with it, including Edgar Wisnart. And he comes out with a book a few years later called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture. Remember, the rapture is what they refer to as the coming of Jesus, but not the second coming because they believe in two second comings. One is the rapture, and then the other would be the second coming. But the first one, Jesus would return. The rapture will be in 1988. And he gives 88 reasons and very specific as to when this would take place. Notice September 11th, 12th, and 13th, and right down to not the exact day, but within a couple of 3 days. Let me just say, Jesus did not come back in 1988, which meant that Wisnant immediately wrote a sequel called something to the effect of 89 Reasons Why It's Really Going to Be in 1989. Jesus didn't come back then either. The next big scare was Y2K, year 2000. That's what the 2K stands for. And computer programmers, as they'd been doing, computers were still a fairly new thing, and sometimes they have dates in them, which mean when they're going to perform certain functions. But computer programs, when they had designed them, had been a little bit lazy. They had put the month, the day, but instead of putting the entire year, like 1988, they would put just 88, sort of a shorthand, and save themselves a few keystrokes. Well, that was working fine up until 1999, but then the following year would go to 00 instead of 2000. And a lot of computer programmers had to go in and readjust the programs. There was a lot of work that needed to be done, but that raised a bit of a concern. And notice this is Time Magazine. Is this going to be the end of the world? Y2K insanity? Apocalypse now? Will computers melt down? Will society? And I remember in my own church, elders in my church at a meeting asked, well, should we be taking any sort of action? And I remember saying to them, guys, the action I'm going to take, I'm going to have a big New Year's party, and you guys are all invited to my house. And sure enough, that New Year's Eve, we had a big party at my house. Now I probably shouldn't have done this, but I couldn't resist. Just as the clock struck 12, I went over to the circuit breaker and hit the circuits and turned all of a sudden, all the lights in the house went out. And I heard somebody in the other room saying, "I told you so, I told you so." The power companies have all, died. And I said, "No, no, no, that was just me playing a practical joke." I turned the lights back on and we continued with our celebration. But Y2K was not a big deal. Jesus didn't come back. It wasn't the apocalypse. None of those things happened. Next, Harold Camping in 2011 had noticed he gave a date as well, May 21st, 2011. He said he had figured it out from the scriptures, though that he looked at some of these prophecies in the book of Daniel, and it gives some references to days and weeks and things like that. And he said that means Jesus is going to come back May 21st, 2011. He didn't. Another prophecy gone bad. Um, and the most recent that I know of, Mark Blitz had made a prophecy. He said, astronomers have seen that there are certain lunar eclipses that are going to be taking place, and they happen to coincide with certain Jewish feasts, like the Passover. Now, for the Passover to take place on a lunar eclipse is not all that uncommon, because the Passover always takes place at that time of the month. That's just, when it's, it will never happen at a solar eclipse, always on a lunar eclipse. But what wasn't quite so commonplace was that you would have a number of different feasts that would all take place and that would all coincide with a lunar eclipse. And so John Hagee picked up on this and actually wrote a book called The Four Blood Moons. Notice the title, Something is About to Change. And he talks about the return of Jesus. So big things are happening. And so something really big, really important must be happening. And the next big thing that's going to happen is that Jesus is going to come back. And so you sort of draw your conclusions. I remember one of my students in class, it was around the year 2014. This book had come out, and he said, "What did I think of John Hagee's prophecy?" And I said, "Well, ask me in a couple of years." and let me just say, 2015 came and went, and nothing happened. And so, what do I think about it? I think it was a lot of nonsense. Let me just say, the book made one really neat observation, that around 30 or 33 AD, I forget which date they picked, around the time when Jesus was crucified, the Passover back then, there was a lunar eclipse. Now, the Bible doesn't mention it, except that the Bible talks about that prophecy of Joel, and Peter cites it in Acts chapter 2, where the moon will be turned to blood. Not literally, but it would, when you have a lunar eclipse, the moon turns red. And maybe that's actually something that took place at the death of Jesus. It would all fit. As far as the rest, nothing happened. Now, let me switch gears completely to women in ministry. I want to go back to the 1800s, where the 1800s saw women being ordained in certain denominations. You hadn't really seen this at a previous date. Throughout most of the history of the church, you didn't have women's ordination. Paul had said something about women having authority over men. First Timothy chapter 2, that he didn't allow that sort of thing. It wasn't really proper. But in the 1800s, you saw women being ordained first by the Methodists and the Wesleyans, but then also by the Universalists, those who felt that all people, all religions are going to lead us to God and everything's going to be okay. And the Salvation Army, which did not really see itself as a denomination. Remember, they did not observe the Lord's Supper or baptize. They left that to the churches, but they also put women into leadership roles. Um, so that's going to cross over now into the 1900s, in the 20th century, where the Pentecostals and the Assemblies of God began to ordain women, and also some of the theologically liberal Protestant churches begin to do this as well. In fact, by the end of the 20th century, you have some of those, and that's come up even now to the present, where some of those are beginning to ordain homosexuals and lesbians, those who engage in alternate sexual lifestyles, where they are beginning to be ordained in some of those denominations as well. And I'm not equating Pentecostal Assemblies of God with those. I'm just saying there's a movement where not just women in ministry, but also other alternate lifestyles beginning to be accepted in some of those denominations. Now, Life magazine, that was a popular magazine in the 1900s. They finally went out of business, but and it sort of looked at all of life, through pictures, that was like a pictorial storytelling. But then a bit later, and a comedian made a big point on this, where you had Life and then People magazine, which doesn't comprise of all of life. People are alive, but not all of life is people. So you had People magazine, and then more recently, you had Us. Us is a magazine. Notice Us is not all of people, it's just Us. It makes you wonder, is there another magazine for them? But then you have another even more recent magazine, Self. Notice how it's narrowing down from life to people to us to it's just about me, self. And we live in the me generation. And the fact that we do makes it all the more striking that you've had the rise of the megachurch. The megachurch, that church that's and usually it's defined as over 2,000 attending. When you go to a megachurch, you're just one tiny clog in a great gathering. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying, and you've had large churches before, but this has become more and more popular. The megachurch, very often in suburban areas, not the downtown city, not out in the country. Out in the country, there's not enough people, but in the suburban areas, functionally non-denominational. Now, some of them actually belong to denominations, but they almost act as if they are a denomination to themselves. And so, very oftentimes, they will not have the denominational name as part of the name of the church. Instead of calling it the something Baptist Church, they'll just call it the Grove or the Urban or the North Point, things like that. There's something there for everyone, because when you're in a church that big, you can diversify in all sorts of small group things for all sorts of different people. It's usually around one highly gifted spiritual leader. When that and as long as that person is there, then things go well. Of course, when he leaves, then you have to get somebody else to come in and take his place, or else the church is going to suffer a problem. Now, I've seen that done well. I've seen that done not so well, with the replacement of the leader. And when it's done well, that can be a wonderful thing. People are initially attracted by the worship style, and it's usually sort of modern or postmodern or upbeat, by the senior pastor, by that one who is gifted, by that one very outgoing, charismatic. And by charismatic, I don't mean with the gift of tongues. I just mean his personality is very reachable. Um, Nearly two-thirds of people have been attenders for 5 years or less, which means it's bringing in a lot of new people. And so, um, if that wasn't the case, then the church would sort of, slow down in its growth rate. But a lot of new people into the church. They may come from other churches, but as a rule, 25% had not been in any church for a long time before coming. And so there's a lot of new growth, either new convert, or people had sort of they'd left the church, but this is their gateway back in, and that's a good thing. That's good. 55% of attender volunteer were 55% of attenders were volunteering in some way. They were involved in some sort of the church, not just coming and sitting in a pew, but actually actively involved, and that's a good thing as well. So notice they for the church to continue to grow, it had to have a lot of body life in the church. Now, one example I'm going to look at, Joel Osteen. Now, I don't mean to pick on him, but he's just one example. He actually describes himself as a motivational speaker, and I get it. He'd not been to Bible college or seminary, and so he didn't have that kind of theological training. More of a motivational speaker, studied communication at Oral Roberts University, so he did have some educational. He took over his father's church, and then took that. And last time I checked, now these numbers might not be up to speed, but an average church attendance at 45,000. That's a very, very, very large church, especially here in this country. He preaches what's often been termed as the prosperity gospel. That is, come to Jesus, and then He'll give you all the things that you want, and you'll be prosperous, and just be positive, and get, Jesus has some great things to give you. If you want a nice house and you want nice looks, and just come to Jesus, and you'll get those things. A little bit different from what we see in the scriptures. He says God is not as concerned about our comfort as He is our purpose. Sometimes He shakes things up to get us to our destiny. And to say happiness is always a choice. You can't wait for circumstances to get better. You have to create your own good fortune. You say, what? What's that? So look for ways to be happy every day. Um, Now, let me just say, I like motivational speakers, but I don't confuse them with what the gospel is. The gospel is not just about being happy; it's about coming to Christ and finding a right relationship with God. Now, we talked about 45,000 in Joel Osteen's megachurch, and it's one of the larger megachurches in the United States. But the largest megachurches are found in other countries. Notice, here's just a listing of some of those. The Yoida Full Gospel Church in Korea, 480,000. The Living Faith Church in Nigeria, 275,000. The Calvary Temple Church in India, 225,000. Notice, and I have them in order of how large they are, going all the way down to Christ Fellowship in the Philippines, 50,000. Joel Osteen's church didn't make it on the list because it wasn't big enough. So you have the larger mega churches in other countries throughout the world. Here's a map showing. Now, this isn't the map showing the largest. These are cities with the most megachurches. There's a difference between cities that have a number of megachurches. Notice in Korea we have a city with 17 megachurches, including the largest in the world. In the United States, we have quite a bit more megachurches to be found. Notice 14 and 19, and I think the 38 is in Texas. Um, I know it's hard to see individual areas in some of those. Um, so you have in the United States more mega churches, but not as big as the very major mega churches that you might have in some other countries. Now, this is by Timothy C. Tennant, the president of Asbury Theological Seminary, and he points out some trends in the global church. And so I want to look at this, and then we'll close. That global churches tend to accept the authority of Scripture, and by Western standards, hold a theology considered conservative, orthodox, and traditionalist. Now, that's not saying that every denomination is going to see them as such, but that's the tendency in the global church, in churches in perhaps South America and in Africa and in Korea and in other locations. That global churches are more likely to be morally and ethically conservative. So, what we said about churches that are ordaining people that are engaged in alternate lifestyles, you're not going to see that so much in the global church as you're going to see that in the Western church. That the global church is more likely to be sensitive to the Christian responsibility to address issues related to poverty and social justice. In the West, we tend to not pay too much attention to poverty and social justice. Sometimes we'll just say, like Joel Osteen, we'll just be happy and God will give you what you want. But the churches globally aren't taking that approach. In fact, the average Christian globally might be somebody who's poorer than average, who's dealing with poverty and having to struggle with that. Trends in the global church, notice they are more experienced at articulating the uniqueness of the gospel in the midst of religious pluralism because they're dealing with other religions that they're having to rub shoulders with Muslims and things like that. And finally, the global church is more likely to grasp the corporate, not just individualistic. Remember how we looked at the individual trend in magazines from life to people to us to self. In the global church, they're more likely to grasp the corporate and not just the individualistic dimensions of the teachings of the New Testament, because the New Testament has its focus not just on me. No, no, it's on us. It's on the corporate nature of Christianity. And we should not forget that Jesus came for us. Does that mean he didn't come from me personally? No, but the emphasis on Scripture is on the body life. And sometimes Western Christianity tends to forget that.